The day Evelyn Ross returned to her family's estate, it rained so hard the clouds seemed to be crying for her. She didn't bother with an umbrella. Let the storm soak her. It wasn't half as cruel as what had been done to her under this roof 12 years ago. She'd left Holopine Manor with nothing but a duffel bag and a broken heart. Her father, Thomas Ross, had called her a disgrace. Her stepmother, Irene, had called her unfit, and her half-brother, Mason, had stood silently beside them while they signed the papers that cut her out of her own family. Why? Because she refused to give up her art. Because she said no to marrying into one of their soulless business alliances. Because she dared to live on her own terms. They said she shamed the Ross name. She said the name never meant anything to her. And she left. She built a life of her own, teaching, painting, surviving. But she never forgot. And now, 12 years later, she was back, because Thomas Ross was dead, and someone had forged his final will. The funeral was exactly what she expected. Grand. Cold. Plastic. Irene wore all black and crocodile tears. Mason wore an expensive suit and a tighter smile. The mourners were all clients and investors, people who had shaken her father's hand more often than they'd ever seen his smile. Evelyn stood at the edge, ignored but noticed. As if her presence were a threat. As if they knew what she knew. She waited for the reading of the will, though she already had the truth folded in her bag. Her real father, flawed and gruff as he was, had found her 3 months before his death. Cancer had taken his strength, but not his guilt. He'd confessed everything. The manipulation, the pressure, the second family's lies. He had cried when he handed her a sealed envelope. They're going to steal everything, Evie. But this is the one thing they can't erase. Inside was a copy of his real will, notarized and signed, naming Evelyn Ross as primary heir to Ross Holdings and rightful owner of Holopine Manor. But when the official will was read after the funeral, it was different. Everything, every dollar, asset and property was left to Mason Ross. Not a single word about Evelyn. Not even a mention. As if she never existed. Later that evening, Irene cornered her near the stone garden. Her voice was sweet poison wrapped in silk. You've had your moment, Evelyn. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm not here for a moment, Evelyn said. I'm here for what's mine. Irene's smile cracked. You think that forged letter will change anything? Evelyn raised an eyebrow. So you admit it's forged? Irene blinked. A misstep. But Evelyn didn't press. Not yet. Because revenge was an art. And she had learned how to paint in layers. That night, Evelyn stayed at the old gardener's house near the edge of the property, the only part of the estate not under Irene's control. It smelled of moss and old tobacco, but it was hers now. Legally, it had always belonged to her grandmother, and the deed had never changed hands. She opened her father's will again, his real will. And this time, she studied it with purpose. If they wanted a war over inheritance, she would fight with precision, not fire. Strategy. The next morning, Evelyn paid a visit to the one man who could confirm the truth, Walter Greaves, her father's longtime private solicitor before Mason and Irene replaced him with their own firm. Walter was retired now, living quietly in a modest cottage in Northmoor. His hair had thinned and his hands trembled slightly with age, but his eyes sharpened when he saw the envelope Evelyn carried. I thought this might come back to haunt them, he muttered, flipping through the pages of the real will. Your father gave this to me in duplicate, said he didn't trust what was happening in the house. He was right not to. Did you keep your copy? I did. And the notary's stamp too. Their version is fake, Miss Ross. I'd swear it under oath. Evelyn closed her hands around his. I may need you to. He nodded once. Your father made mistakes, but he tried to fix them. Don't let them bury that. She left with more than validation. She left with a weapon. Evelyn didn't file a legal claim immediately. Instead, she started by leaking a whisper. An anonymous tip to the Herald Ledger, a regional publication known for peeling back the pristine image of elite families. The article was small, buried in the business section, but it raised a quiet storm. Legal questions arise over Ross Holdings' inheritance potential while tampering alleged. Irene and Mason were blindsided. Within a day, Evelyn received a phone call from Mason. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice tight. "Did I sign the wrong name on the fake will?" She replied smoothly. Silence. "You always hated this place," he said bitterly. "I hated what it turned you into." He hung up, and she smiled. Because that was all she needed to know. They were scared. Evelyn's next move was elegant. She hosted a gallery event in the city not under her own name, but under her artist pseudonym, Ava Lorne. She showcased a new series of paintings titled Disinherited. One painting depicted a woman with a golden key buried beneath her skin. Another showed an estate crumbling from within, its foundations built on lies. Critics loved it. But more importantly, so did investors. Whispers spread that Ava Lorne was Evelyn Ross, and that she wasn't just making art, she was making a statement. The board members of Ross Holdings noticed, because legacy wasn't just built in boardrooms. It was built in public perception. Irene retaliated by calling a press conference. She painted Evelyn as a bitter, estranged child, desperate for attention, manipulating grieving staff and exploiting a dead man's regrets. Mason stood behind her, stoic and silent, but Evelyn wasn't watching the conference. She was sitting in a lawyer's office with Walter Greaves and a team of litigation experts, submitting the official succession dispute to probate court. And as the ink dried, her phone buzzed, a private message from an anonymous number. "They forged more than the will. Ask about the Somerton Trust. It's how they hid the money." The text included one document: a banking transfer from Ross Holdings to a private account under Mason's name, dated just 2 weeks before her father's death. Evelyn leaned back, stunned. If this was real, it wasn't just fraud. It was embezzlement. She dug into it. Quietly, the Somerton Trust was a shell entity created 3 years ago and funneled with hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of unaccounted funds. Her father never knew. Irene and Mason had set it up when he became ill, slipping money out of the company through consulting fees and overseas investments. She printed everything, and this time, she didn't send it to the press. She sent it to the board of Ross Holdings, with no signature. Just one line on the cover page: "You trusted the wrong heir." By the end of the week, Holopine Manor had become a house of whispers. The board of Ross Holdings convened an emergency session behind closed doors. Irene released a second statement dismissing digital forgeries and baseless slander. Mason refused to answer any calls from the press, but the damage had already spread wide, and irreversible, because the documents Evelyn sent weren't just convincing, they were real. A confidential audit began immediately. The board brought in an external firm to verify the records, and when the numbers aligned with Evelyn's evidence, everything shifted. The chairman, a stoic man named Louis Decker, who had been loyal to Thomas Ross for 30 years, personally requested a meeting with Evelyn. It was the first time someone from that world, not a reporter, not a gossip, looked her in the eye with respect. "Miss Ross," he said, offering her a chair, "we owe you more than an apology. We owe you the truth." She nodded calmly, knowing this was her moment, but not showing even a flicker of triumph. "I'm not asking for revenge," she said. "I'm asking for restoration. I want my name returned, my position acknowledged, and I want what was stolen to be made public." Decker didn't blink. "You'll have it." 2 days later, Mason was officially suspended from all operations. His name removed from the company registry. Irene's legal firm, which had been handling Ross Holdings' finances, was placed under investigation for financial misconduct and forgery. The story went national. Ross empire robbed by inheritance fraud, disowned daughter at center of scandal. Evelyn didn't speak to the press. She let the silence speak louder, because while Irene and Mason scrambled for damage control, Evelyn focused on something else: legacy. She walked the halls of Holopine again for the first time in years, not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as its rightful owner. The portraits remained unchanged. The furniture was exactly as she remembered. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a house of ghosts. It was hers, and she was going to reclaim it piece by piece. She began renovating not with cold modern excess like Irene had, but with reverence. She restored the old studio her mother once painted in. She opened up the family library and invited local artists, students, and writers to work there freely. And she announced the founding of the Ross Foundation for Women in the Arts. Seated with the first wave of reclaimed funds from the Somerton Trust, the estate came alive again, not with forced smiles and tailored suits, but with laughter, creativity, and purpose, and the name Evelyn Ross, once erased, now held more power than Mason ever imagined. Mason, meanwhile, was quiet until the letter.it arrived on ivory stationery unsigned. "You won. Are you satisfied?" Evelyn read it once, then twice, and for a brief moment, she thought about replying, but then she walked into the garden where her father used to read on Sundays, and she sat in his old wooden chair, the sun warm on her face, the trees heavy with new green. She smiled. Not because she'd won, but because she hadn't let them change her. Because the girl they cast out, the disgrace, the mistake, had come back not to destroy the house, but to rebuild it in her own name, and in doing so, she hadn't just reclaimed what was hers, she had redefined what it meant to inherit. A year later, Holopine was no longer a monument to silence.it was a living thing, vibrant with music, workshops, gallery showings, and youth programs funded by Evelyn's foundation. The main house still bore the Ross name, but it now stood for something radically different. Healing, not hierarchy. In the West Wing, Evelyn converted the ballroom into a creative space. Local girls from struggling schools gathered there on weekends to paint, write, and dream just as she once did, in secret, behind locked doors. She never told them her story. She let them write their own, but they knew. Everyone did. The daughter they once erased had become the one name everyone respected, not for the money she regained, but for the grace with which she handled the war. The final lawsuit against Mason settled quietly. No jail time, but a heavy fine and a full ban from corporate leadership. He vanished from the city soon after, rumors circling of a failed business in Prague. Irene, stripped of her practice and reputation, moved in with her sister out west. No apology ever came. Evelyn didn't need one, because forgiveness wasn't owed to them. It was owed to herself, and she had given it, not in words, but in building something stronger than revenge. The day Evelyn unveiled the new Ross Art Center in the heart of the city, the press lined the entrance. But she didn't speak to the cameras. She spoke only to the crowd inside, former colleagues of her father, struggling artists, teachers, and teenagers who had followed her story and believed they too could come back from being forgotten. "I was once told I didn't belong," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "That family is defined by legacy and blood. But I've learned legacy is what you build when no one is watching, and family is what you protect when everything else is taken." She stepped down without applause, but the silence that followed was powerful, because no one wanted to break the weight of what she'd just said. That night, Evelyn returned to Holopine alone. She poured herself a glass of wine and wandered into her father's old study, now redesigned, with her paintings on the walls and her mother's journals on the shelf. On his desk, she placed two things, the fake will and the real one, side by side. She lit a single match and burned both, because the paper no longer mattered. She had taken back the truth, and that truth didn't need to be proven anymore. It had already been lived. Outside, the stars glimmered over the lawn, and Evelyn Ross, once disowned, once forgotten, now stood at the window of the home that once pushed her away, smiling not out of victory but out of peace. She didn't inherit the family name. She redefined it, and that was the final stroke in the masterpiece she'd spent 12 years painting, a legacy of her own.